Welcome to Trion's Realm. Today we're going to take a look at the physical version of the Final Fantasy 1 through 6 collection for the Nintendo Switch. This is generally known as the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster collection. Now this features all of the mainline Final Fantasy games from both the original Nintendo era as well as the Super Nintendo era. Now when it comes to their original releases here in the US, we only got 3 of the 6 titles through the early to mid-90s. That was specifically Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 as they were known here in the States, but in reality they were Final Fantasy 1, 4, and 6. After Final Fantasy 7 blew up and became a huge hit, we started getting a lot of the other entries, specifically 2 and 5, and then I believe it was 2007 when we finally got Final Fantasy 3 on the Nintendo DS. And they have gone on to be ported many times to many different systems over the years. Now what Square Enix did with this collection was they decided to do full pixel remasters of the first 6 entries to essentially create their version of a definitive version of the games. That could be considered arguable among many fans who love a lot of different versions, but this was their way of collecting them all together and releasing them as one full package. Now when it comes to updates to the games, there were a ton of quality of life features that were added into these titles in particular. They had everything from mini-maps to the option to walk or run at the flick of a button. You could even turn your encounters on or off for those that would get a little tired of doing random battling while they're playing through the game. They gave options for auto-battling. There's even diagonal movement, which feels a bit weird if you've spent most of your time playing the old school versions of these. And there's a lot of other options that you can change within the menus within each game. Things like they have a modernized font style, although personally I'd recommend the classic as the modernized version looks pretty bad. It has a smooth mobile look to it, whereas the classic version of the font looks like the pixel style that you're used to and is better suited for these titles. You can customize the graphic display. You can switch between standard and classic. Standard is a crisp pixel look, no filters, and in classic is their attempt to make it look like you're playing it on a CRT. It looks a little overdone in my opinion, but as someone who did play them back in the day, they've at least got it in the ballpark of what you may have experienced back then. This is honestly a tough thing for a lot of games to get right. You can also change the background music. By default, you have the arrangement version. Nobuo Uematsu, he personally oversaw the arrangements of all the music. And personally, I think he did a pretty damn good job. Although I will say there are a couple things that sound a bit off in my opinion. Could be that I'm personally used to hearing it in its old style. But fortunately, they do give you the option to switch back to the original, which sounds just as great as it always did. And if you go into the menus under configuration and you go to boost, they allow you to change your experience and gil that you earn. So you can turn these down to make it much harder and more grindy, or you can crank it up so you have to fight far less and you'll get your money and a lot more experience much quicker. So for those of you who don't want to drop the traditional 20 to 30 hours that most of these titles require, you could probably cut that easily in half with these options. The games themselves hold up their classic feel, and this is probably one of the best official ways to replay these titles at this point. All of the titles hold up just as well as they did back in the day, although it'll feel a little archaic for people who are used to more modern RPGs. But when you consider that the basis of the JRPG is essentially derived from both the first Final Fantasy and the first Dragon Quest, you can easily see the DNA that has crossed over into modern titles, as well as the series that has pulled the most from these two, and that would be Pokemon. Now when it comes to the physical version, the total of all of these games is about 5.6 gigabytes, which means that Square Enix opted for an 8 gigabyte cartridge. And I'll go ahead and give you a quick breakdown of each title. Now we'll start off with the first 3. You have Final Fantasy 1 that clocks in at 700 megabytes, Final Fantasy 2, 693 megabytes, and Final Fantasy 3, which is 834 megabytes. All 3 versions on the cartridge are version 1.0.0. And when you update all 3, it takes them to version 1.0.2. Final Fantasy 1's patch size is 82.6 megabytes. Final Fantasy 2 is 86 megabytes. And Final Fantasy 3's patch is 94.3 megabytes. And as for the Super Nintendo trilogy, Final Fantasy IV is 866 megabytes, Final Fantasy V is 1 gigabyte, and Final Fantasy VI is 1.5 gigabytes. The on-cartridge version for all three is 1.0.1. Final Fantasy IV, with its patch, updates to version 1.0.3, and that clocks in 126 megabytes. When Final Fantasy V and VI are updated, it takes both of those up to version 1.0.4. Final Fantasy V's patch is 117 megabytes, and Final Fantasy VI's patch is 173 megabytes. I did try all 6 games unpatched, and they all worked just fine, but in doing some research, I did find that there were some bugs and issues that did crop up that were addressed by these patches. When it comes to the patches for all 6 games, this is directly from the notes. They're listed as improvements to the stability of game functions and also fixes for several bugs. Now, Final Fantasy V and VI in particular had some additional bugs that could cause the games to freeze, but these are pretty rare, but they did have to address them in these patches. The cartridge revision ends in 000. According to everything that I've seen online, it's looking like Square Enix opted to use the ESRB version for the Asian English release last year and just reprinted that one for us. And unfortunately, this means that the games are not 100% complete on cart when it comes to the patches. Unfortunately, this is kind of a common practice with them. They don't bother putting out the revised cartridges the way that, say, Nintendo does, which is irritating because this was something that could have easily been fixed and could have made this the ultimate version. As it stands, if you did buy one of the English language versions from over at, say, Play Asia, just hold on to it. It's essentially the same version that you have here. What are your feelings on Final Fantasies 1 through 6? I would honestly like to know which ones are your favorite, which ones would you rank at the top. If this video helped you and you'd like to see more, please subscribe and hit that like button. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you later.